USS Archerfish vs. Shinano, the greatest submarine kill in history. Part 1. The Giant in the Fog. In November 1944, the Empire of Japan was bleeding. The American island-hopping campaign had pushed the Japanese Navy back to its home waters. But in the secret shipyards of Yokosuka, a monster was waking up. It was the Shinano. Originally designed as a Yamato-class battleship, she had been converted into a massive aircraft carrier. She was nearly 900 feet long. She displaced over 72,000 tons. She was the largest warship ever built at that time, a floating fortress meant to turn the tide of the war. The Japanese believed she was unsinkable. They believed no American torpedo could ever reach her heart. But as the Shinano slipped out of the harbor for her secret maiden voyage, she didn't know that a small steel shadow was waiting in the darkness of the Pacific. That shadow was the USS Archerfish, a Below-class submarine commanded by Commander Joseph Enright. This wasn't supposed to be a historic mission. The Archerfish was just looking for downed B-29 pilots. Instead, they were about to find the holy grail of naval warfare. The radar contact, the night of November 28th, was cold and the seas were choppy. Commander Enright was on the bridge of the Archerfish, his eyes stinging from the salt spray. At approximately 8:48 p.m., the radar operator shouted a report that felt like a bolt of lightning. Contact. Range 24,000 yards. At first, Enright thought it was a small island, but the island was moving. It was moving fast, nearly 20 knots. Enright looked through his binoculars, squinting into the gloom. He saw a shape so large, so wide, that his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. He thought it was a large tanker, then he thought it was an island-hopping transport. He never imagined that he had just stumbled upon the crown jewel of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Archerfish was a David standing in the path of a Goliath, and the hunt was on. The Predator's dilemma. The Shinano wasn't traveling alone. She was escorted by 3 Japanese destroyers, bristling with depth charges and sonar. For Joseph Enright, this was a moment of agonizing calculation. If he stayed on the surface to maintain speed, the destroyers would see him. If he dived, the massive carrier would outrun him in minutes. The Archerfish was at the limit of its endurance. To catch the target, Enright had to run his engines at flank speed, pushing the submarine until the metal groaned and the pistons threatened to explode. "We're going to chase him," Enright told his crew. "And we're going to stay on the surface until they see us." It was a bold, aggressive move. The Archerfish began a grueling 6-hour pursuit, zigzagging across the dark water, trying to get ahead of a giant that moved with the speed of a predator. A game of shadows inside the Shinano. The Japanese commander, Captain Abe, was nervous. He knew the Americans had submarines everywhere. Every time his radar picked up a faint signal, he ordered the carrier to zigzag, changing direction to throw off any potential torpedoes. Ironically, this was his fatal mistake. By zigzagging, the massive Shinano was actually traveling a longer distance. This allowed the slower Archerfish to cut the corners of the giant's path. For hours, the 2 ships danced in the dark. The Archerfish was like a terrier nipping at the heels of a bull. Every time the carrier turned, Enright moved closer. Every time the destroyers swept their searchlights, the Archerfish held its breath in the shadows. The tension inside the submarine was suffocating. The men were silent, focused, and ready. They knew that if they were spotted, they would be crushed. But they also knew that they were chasing the greatest prize in the history of the United States Navy. The final turn, at approximately 3 a.m., the Shinano made one final fateful turn. Captain Abe, believing he had outrun any pursuers, turned his ship directly toward the Archerfish's position. It was a gift from the gods of war. Enright saw the massive bow of the carrier swinging into his field of vision. The range was closing fast. 3,000 yards, 2,000 yards. Man battle stations. Enright's voice echoed through the sub. The suicide mission of the chase was over. The execution was about to begin. The Archerfish dived to periscope depth. the cold water of the Pacific washing over its hull like a shroud. The giant was in the crosshairs. The world was about to hear a bang that would echo through history. Part 2. The Spread of 3:17 a.m. November 29, 1944. Inside the steel belly of the USS Archerfish, the silence was absolute. Commander Joseph Enright stood at the periscope, his hands gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles were white. The air inside the submarine was thick with the smell of sweat, hydraulic oil, and the electric hum of the batteries. Through the lens, the world was a ghostly shade of green. And in that green world, a mountain of steel was moving. The Shinano was so massive that it filled the entire field of view. From his position at periscope depth, Enright wasn't just looking at a ship. He was looking at a wall of armor that seemed to stretch into infinity. The carrier was less than 1,500 yards away, a point-blank range for a submarine. This was the moment of truth. Enright knew that the Shinano's escorts, 3 battle-hardened destroyers, were searching the water with their sonar. Every second he spent at periscope depth was a second he spent flirting with death. He took a final breath, adjusted the lead angle on the torpedo data computer, and gave the command that would change naval history forever. Set depth at 10 feet. Fire number 1. The mechanical sequence of death. Fire number 2. Fire number 3. In 8-second intervals, the Archerfish shuddered as 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were kicked out of the bow tubes by high-pressure air. These weren't just projectiles. They were 21-inch wide cylinders of high explosives, each carrying 600 pounds of torpex. Enright had chosen a spread pattern. He didn't fire them all at one spot. He aimed them in a line, calculated to hit the carrier from the bow to the stern. He wanted to rip open the entire side of the giant. Inside the sub, the crew held their breath. They could hear the whir of their own torpedoes moving away from them. Then came the waiting. Sound travels fast underwater, but to the 68 men inside the Archerfish, those seconds felt like hours. They were counting in their heads. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. If the torpedoes missed, the destroyers would be on top of them in an instant. If they had duds, a common problem with American torpedoes, early in the war, they would have revealed their position for nothing. The thunder of Goliath's heart at 47 seconds, the world inside the Archerfish exploded with sound. T-H-U-D, the first hit. A deep, heavy vibration that shook the submarine's hull. Thud, thud. In rapid succession, 3 more hits followed. 4 out of the 6 torpedoes had found their mark. Through the periscope, Enright saw a pillar of fire erupt from the side of the Shinano. A massive ball of orange flame climbed hundreds of feet into the night sky, illuminating the carrier's flight deck. The giant had been struck in its soft underbelly, right where the armor was supposed to be strongest. The 4th torpedo hit the stern, directly into the propeller shafts and the engine rooms. The Archerfish hadn't just hit the ship, it had paralyzed it. "We hit him!" The sonar operator yelled. Direct hits, multiple explosions. But the celebration was short-lived. The giant was wounded, but the guard dogs were now awake. The descent into the abyss. Take her down. Enright roared, "Dive! Dive! Rig for depth charge!" The Archerfish's nose dipped sharply as it flooded its tanks, screaming toward the safety of the deep water. Enright knew what was coming. The 3 Japanese destroyers, the Isokaze, the Hamikaze, and the Yukikaze, were already turning. Their propellers were churning the water into a frenzy as they raced toward the Archerfish's last known position. Inside the sub, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. They rigged for silence. They turned off the fans. They turned off the lights. They spoke only in whispers. Suddenly, the first ping of the Japanese sonar hit the hull. It sounded like a hammer hitting a metal pipe. Ping, ping, they were being tracked. Then came the depth charges. Boom. The first explosion was close enough to knock the cork insulation off the ceiling. The submarine buckled. Light bulbs shattered. The smell of chlorine gas from the batteries began to drift through the lower decks. The Archerfish was no longer the hunter, it was the prey. The giant's last breath. As the Archerfish endured over 14 hours of depth charge attacks, thousands of feet above them, the Shinano was fighting a losing battle. The Japanese damage control teams were in a state of chaos. The carrier was brand new, and many of the watertight doors hadn't been finished. The crew was inexperienced. They didn't realize that the 4 torpedoes had breached the main boiler rooms. The largest aircraft carrier in the world was slowly filling with the cold, dark water of the Pacific. Captain Abe on the Shinano still believed they could make it to port. He ordered the ship to keep moving, but the movement only forced more water into the hull. The giant was drowning from the inside out. Inside the Archerfish, huddled in the darkness, Joseph Enright listened to the sonar. He didn't hear the destroyers anymore. He heard something else, a deep, grinding sound. The sound of a massive structure collapsing under the pressure of the ocean. The unsinkable myth was dying. And the USS Archerfish was the only witness. The hunt was over. The execution was complete. But the escape had only just begun. Part 3. The Unsinkable Myth. The 4 explosions that rocked the Shinano at 3:20 a.m. were not just mechanical failures. They were the sound of a dream dying. Inside the massive hull of the 72,000-ton carrier, the impact felt like the hand of a god had struck the ship. Men were thrown from their bunks. Deep in the boiler rooms, the steel plates thick as a man's torso buckled and tore like wet paper. Captain Toshio Abe, standing on the bridge, felt the ship shudder in a way no battleship should. He looked at his damage control board. 4 red lights were blinking. 4 direct hits, all on the starboard side. The Japanese had built the Shinano on the hull of a Yamato-class battleship. They believed her armor was impenetrable. They believed that even 4 American torpedoes would be nothing more than a mosquito bite to this steel giant. They were wrong. The Shinano was a titan with a glass heart, and the clock was already ticking. The unfinished fortress. The greatest tragedy of the Shinano was that she was never ready for war. Rushed out of the shipyards of Yokosuka to escape American bombers, the ship was a construction site on the water. Hundreds of civilian shipyard workers were still on board. Heavy machinery was still bolted to the decks. Cables ran through open doors. But the most fatal flaw lay in the watertight doors. To save time, many of the seals had not been tested. Some doors didn't have rubber gaskets to keep the water out. In the chaos of the flooding, the crew found that when they tried to seal off the damaged compartments, the water simply leaked around the edges. The unsinkable myth was being defeated by a lack of simple rubber seals. In the engine rooms, the situation was a nightmare. The 4th torpedo had struck the stern, shattering the propeller shafts and flooding the main boiler rooms. The lights flickered and died. The pumps, the only things that could save the ship, lost power. The largest carrier in the world was suddenly a dark, hollow cave, slowly filling with the cold Pacific. The command of arrogance Captain Abe was a traditionalist. He believed in the strength of Japanese steel. Instead of stopping the ship to assess the damage, he ordered the Shinano to maintain a speed of 18 knots. He believed he could outrun the submarine and reach the safety of the inland sea. This was a catastrophic mistake. By moving the ship forward at high speed, the water pressure against the 4 massive holes in the hull increased tenfold. Thousands of tons of water were being scooped into the ship, forcing the flooding to spread even faster into the upper decks. By 5 a.m., the Shinano was tilting 10 degrees to the starboard side. On the massive flight deck, sailors and workers struggled to stay upright. Equipment began to slide across the steel. The 3 escorting destroyers circled the giant, their searchlights cutting through the mist, their crews watching in horror as the largest ship they had ever seen began to lean toward its grave. The panic of the inexperienced. A ship is only as good as the men who sail her. The Shinano had a crew of over 2,500 men, but most were new recruits who had never seen combat. They hadn't been trained in damage control. When the water began to rise, they didn't know how to patch the holes or shore up the bulkheads. Panic began to spread like a virus through the lower decks. The civilian workers, terrified of being trapped in the dark, rushed for the ladders, blocking the sailors who were trying to reach the valves. Captain Abe tried to counter the tilt by counter-flooding, purposely letting water into the opposite side of the ship to level it out. But the valves were stuck, the pumps were dead. By 7:30 a.m., the list reached 15 degrees. The ocean was now pouring over the edge of the hangar deck. The Shinano was no longer a warship. It was a dying animal, gasping for air. The realization of doom. At 10 a.m., the sun rose over the Pacific, revealing the full scale of the disaster. The Shinano was now dead in the water. Her engines were silent. The tilt had reached 30 degrees. Men were clinging to the railings, looking down into the churning white water where the starboard side of the flight deck was already submerged. Captain Abe finally understood. No miracle was coming. No secret weapon would save them. He looked at the portrait of the Emperor, and then at his officers. With a voice heavy with shame, he gave the final order, abandon ship. But for many, the order came too late. The internal companionways were now vertical shafts. Thousands of men were trapped deep inside the belly of the Titan, listening to the roar of the water getting closer and closer. The giant was rolling over. The plunge into the deep, at 10:48 a.m., exactly 7 hours after the Archerfish fired its torpedoes, the Shinano's center of gravity gave way. The massive carrier rolled completely onto its side. The flight deck, once a platform for the pride of the Japanese Air Force, slapped the surface of the water with a sound like a thunderclap. As the ship slipped under the waves, it created a massive suction vortex. Hundreds of sailors who had jumped into the water were pulled back toward the sinking hull. They were swallowed by the very ship they had lived on. Within minutes, the 72,000-ton monster vanished. A few oil slicks, some floating debris, and over 1,400 dead men were all that remained of the greatest naval project in Japanese history. Down in the deep, the Archerfish was still hiding. They heard the breaking up noises. They heard the crushed depth explosions. Joseph Enright didn't know what he had sunk yet. He only knew that the island he had chased was gone. The Titan had fallen. The shadow had won. Part 4. The Deep Silence. At 10:48 a.m., the Pacific Ocean swallowed the Shinano. For a few seconds, the surface of the sea was a chaotic nightmare of white foam, boiling bubbles, and the debris of a broken empire. But then, as the last of the air escaped the sinking hull, a terrifying silence fell over the water. But for the 1,400 Japanese sailors struggling in the oil-slicked waves, the silence was short-lived. When a ship of 72,000 tons sinks, it does not go quietly. As the Shinano plunged toward the seabed over 2 miles down, it created a massive suction vortex. It was a liquid tornado that pulled everything near it into the abyss. Men who had successfully jumped clear were suddenly dragged backward, screaming, as the giant reached out from the depths to claim them one last time. Of the 2,500 souls on board, only 1,080 were pulled from the water. The rest were gone, victims of the largest submarine kill in human history. But beneath the waves, the men who had pulled the trigger were still fighting for their lives. The death groans of a giant inside the USS Archerfish, 200 feet below the surface. The crew wasn't cheering. They were listening. In a submarine, sound is your only window to the world. Through the sonar headsets, the operator heard a series of sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It started with a low, metallic moan. This was the sound of the Shinano's bulkheads collapsing under the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. Then came a series of sharp pops and cracks, like giant pieces of popcorn exploding in the distance. "She's breaking up," the sonar operator whispered to Commander Joseph Enright. Each crack represented a deck collapsing or a boiler exploding. To the men of the Archerfish, it was proof of their victory, but it was also a reminder of the power of the ocean. They knew that if the Japanese destroyers found them, their own ship would make those same terrifying noises. The shift of the hunters above them, the 3 Japanese destroyers, the Isokaze, the Hamikaze, and the Yukikaze, were in a state of mourning and absolute rage. Their mission had been a total failure. They had been tasked with protecting the secret weapon of the Emperor, and they had let a single American tramp submarine take it away. For the first hour after the sinking, the destroyers were distracted. They had to pick up the survivors, including Captain Abe, who was found clinging to a piece of wood, staring blankly at the spot where his ship had vanished. But once the survivors were on deck, the destroyers turned back to the hunt. They didn't just want to find the Archerfish. They wanted vengeance. They began a creeping attack. They moved slowly, their sonar pings cutting through the water like knives, searching for the heartbeat of the American intruder. Ping, ping. Inside the Archerfish, the temperature was rising. To save oxygen and maintain ultra-quiet status, Enright had turned off the air conditioning. The walls were dripping with condensation. The men were soaked in sweat, standing perfectly still at their stations. "The stealthy exit, rig for silent running," Enright ordered. The Archerfish was moving at just 2 knots, barely enough to maintain steering. Every motor that wasn't essential was shut down. The crew wore socks over their shoes to dampen the sound of their footsteps on the metal floor. Enright knew he couldn't stay in the kill zone forever. He had to lead the Archerfish away from the sinking site, but he had to do it without making a sound. Suddenly, a series of depth charges exploded. Boom. Boom. They were further away now, but the shockwaves still rattled the submarine's hull. The Japanese were box patterning the area, dropping explosives in a grid, hoping for a lucky hit. Enright watched the depth gauge. He took the Archerfish down to its test depth, the very limit of what the steel hull could withstand. The metal groaned and popped under the pressure. Every man in the sub looked at the ceiling, wondering if the rivets would hold. For 4 agonizing hours, they crawled through the darkness. The sonar pings grew fainter. The explosions moved further to the north. The shadow was slipping away. The captain's doubt. As the Archerfish finally moved into safer waters and began its slow climb back to the surface, Joseph Enright sat in his tiny cabin with the patrol log. He had to write down what he had seen, but as he looked at his notes, he felt a wave of doubt. He had estimated the target at 28,000 tons, the size of a standard carrier. But his eyes told him something different. He remembered the periscope view. The ship was so large, it had blocked out the horizon. It felt bigger than anything in the American fleet. He checked the Japanese recognition books. There was nothing that large. No carrier in the world was 70,000 tons. If I report a 70,000-ton carrier, Enright thought, the Office of Naval Intelligence will laugh me out of the Pacific. They'll think I've been underwater too long. He decided to play it safe. He wrote, "Large carrier believed to be Shokaku class." He didn't realize that he had just killed a ghost. He had destroyed a ship that the United States didn't even know existed. The breath of fresh air. Late that night, the Archerfish finally broke the surface. The hatch opened, and the cool, salt air of the Pacific rushed into the stale, sweaty interior. The crew scrambled onto the deck, gasping for breath, looking up at the stars. They were alive. They had survived the depth charges. They had survived the pressure. And they had completed the hunt. But as they looked back toward the Japanese coast, they felt the weight of the moment. They were the only ones who knew that a giant had fallen. They were the only ones who knew that the balance of power in the Pacific had just shifted forever. The Archerfish began its long journey back to the base at Midway. They were going home as heroes, but they were also going home with a mystery that would take months to solve. The Titan was at the bottom of the sea. The hunters were safe. But the world was about to be stunned by the truth. Part 5. The Verdict. On December 15th, 1944, the USS Archerfish drifted into the lagoon at Midway Atoll. The crew stood on the deck, bearded, salt-stained, and exhausted. They had been at sea for 48 days. They had survived a depth charge battering that should have sent them to the bottom. But they were carrying a secret that was burning a hole in Commander Joseph Enright's pocket. Enright stepped off the gangplank and headed straight for the intelligence office. He carried a hand-drawn sketch, a drawing of a ship so large it looked like a fantasy. He sat down across from the naval intelligence officers and laid out his report. "We sank a carrier," Enright said, "a big one. Maybe 28,000 tons. Maybe more." The officers looked at each other. They looked at the sketches. Then they looked back at Enright with pity. "Commander," one of them said, "the Japanese don't have a carrier that big. Our intelligence says there's nothing in the Pacific even close to what you're describing. You probably hit a tanker or a converted transport." The greatest kill in history was being dismissed as a fishtail. The Battle of the Sketches. Joseph Enright wasn't a man who liked to be told he was wrong. He knew what he had seen through that periscope. He knew the way the horizon had disappeared behind the hull of that ship. "Look at the shape of the island," Enright insisted. "Look at the flight deck. It's not a tanker. It's a monster." The intelligence community was stubborn. According to their records, all of Japan's large carriers were accounted for. They believed they knew every ship in the Emperor's fleet. They didn't know about the secret shipyards of Yokosuka. They didn't know about the Yamato-class conversion. For weeks, the Archerfish was only credited with sinking a medium-sized carrier, a Hyo-class ship of about 20,000 tons. It was still a victory, but Enright felt like he had been robbed of the truth. It wasn't until after the war, when American investigators entered Japan and began digging through the charred remains of the Imperial Navy as secret archives, that the world finally learned the name Shinano. The shockwave of truth. When the Japanese documents were translated, the Office of Naval Intelligence was stunned into silence. They found the blueprints. They found the crew manifests. They found the records of a ship that weighed 72,000 tons, 3 times larger than what they thought the Archerfish had hit. The Shinano was not just a carrier. She was the single largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine in the history of the world. The news sent shockwaves through the Navy. Joseph Enright was no longer just a lucky commander. He was a giant killer. The Archerfish was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Enright was awarded the Navy Cross. The ghost of the Pacific had been real. And a small crew of 68 men, squeezed into a steel tube, had sent it to a watery grave before it could ever launch a single plane. The legend of the Archerfish, the Archerfish's victory, became a masterclass in submarine warfare. It wasn't just about the torpedoes. It was about the persistence. Enright had chased the target for over 6 hours on the surface, pushing his engines to the breaking point. He had predicted the target's movements. He had managed his crew's fear under a rain of depth charges. But most importantly, the sinking of the Shinano was a symbolic end to an era. It was the moment the world realized that even the most massive armored giants of the surface were vulnerable to the silent service lurking in the deep. The Archerfish continued to serve long after the war. She participated in oceanographic research and served as a reminder of a night in 1944 when a David found his Goliath. When the Archerfish was finally decommissioned and sunk as a target in 1968, she went down with the honors of a champion. She was a ship that had looked into the eyes of a titan and didn't blink. The final tally let the numbers sink in. 1 submarine, 1,500 tons. 1 carrier, 72,000 tons. It remains the most lopsided victory in naval history. No other submarine from any nation has ever come close to the tonnage destroyed by the Archerfish in a single night. To this day, in the halls of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, the story of Joseph Enright and the Shinano is told to every new recruit. It's a story about looking closer. It's a story about holding your ground, because sometimes the island moving in the fog isn't an island at all. Sometimes it's the greatest prize you'll ever find, and you only get one chance to take it. The deepest honor, the Shinano still lies at the bottom of the Pacific, over 2 miles down, in the dark and the cold. She is a monument to a lost empire and a secret that couldn't be kept. And the Archerfish? She is a legend that continues to patrol the memories of every submariner who goes to sea. The hunt is over. The verdict is in. The USS Archerfish didn't just sink a ship. She sank a myth. Part 6. The Ghost's Legacy. History is written in the blood of the brave, but it is often decided by the smallest of details. The sinking of the Shinano remains a masterclass in the law of unintended consequences. The Japanese Empire spent millions of man-hours and the last of its precious steel to build a god of the seas. Yet, it was undone by a crew of 68 Americans and a series of fatal shortcuts. But as the smoke cleared and the war ended, the world began to ask, how? How did a ship built from the bones of a Yamato-class battleship, the most heavily armored hulls ever conceived, collapse so quickly? The answer lies not just in the torpedoes of the USS Archerfish, but in the ghost that the Shinano had become before she even left the dock. The technical execution, a fatal geometry modern naval historians have spent decades studying the gash left by Joseph Enright's torpedoes. If the Archerfish had hit the Shinano anywhere else, the Titan might have survived. But Enright's spread of 6 was accidentally perfect. By hitting the starboard side in a long line, he created what engineers call the free surface effect. Because the ship was moving so fast, the water didn't just leak in. It rammed in. As the lower compartments flooded, the center of gravity shifted. The Shinano was top-heavy because of its massive flight deck. Once the water reached a certain level, the ship didn't just sink, it capsized. It was a mechanical tipping point that no amount of armor could stop. The very size of the Shinano, her greatest strength, became the weight that dragged her to the bottom. The secret cargo, the Oka rockets. For years, a rumor circulated among Japanese veterans. They said the Shinano wasn't just moving to a new base. She was carrying a secret death. In the cargo hold, hidden beneath the hangar decks, were 50 Oka suicide rocket planes. These were the ultimate kamikaze weapons, human-guided, missiles designed to fly at 500 miles per hour into American carriers. If the Shinano had reached the inland sea, those 50 rockets would have been used during the Battle of Okinawa. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of American sailors would have died. The men of the Archerfish didn't just sink a ship. They executed a preemptive strike that saved an entire fleet. They killed the mother ship before her children could be unleashed. The two captains, a study in contrast. The story of the Shinano is the story of two men who never met, but whose lives were forever linked by a periscope lens. Captain Toshio Abe of the Shinano was a man of the old world. He believed in the invincibility of the Japanese spirit. After the sinking, he was devastated by the shame of losing the emperor's greatest ship. He lived the rest of his life in the shadow of that morning, a man who had seen a god die on his watch. Commander Joseph Enright, on the other hand, became the symbol of the new American Navy. He was analytical, humble, and persistent. He didn't brag about the kill. He focused on the lessons learned. When Enright passed away in the year 2000, he was buried with full military honors. He never forgot the Archerfish. He never forgot the mountain he saw in the fog. He knew that his victory wasn't just about his skill, it was about every mechanic who tightened a bolt and every cook who served a meal in the belly of that submarine. The final resting place. Today, the Shinano lies in one of the deepest parts of the Pacific, over 12,000 feet down. She rests in total darkness, a massive steel tomb that will likely never be visited by human eyes. She remains the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine, a record that will almost certainly never be broken. In the age of nuclear missiles and satellite tracking, the long chase of the Archerfish seems like a story from another world. But the spirit of the silent service remains. The idea that a small, determined group of people can change the course of history through stealth and grit is as true today as it was in 1944. The USS Archerfish is gone, but her name is carved into the Hall of Heroes. And the Shinano? She is the shadow that reminds us, no giant is too big to fall, and no shadow is too small to strike. The conclusion of the Titan. The hunt of the Archerfish was the grand finale of the submarine war in the Pacific. It was the moment the scale of power was balanced once and for all. As the sun sets over the graveyard of the Pacific, we remember the hunters and the hunted. We remember the steel and the men. And we remember that in the deep, silence is the greatest weapon of all. The ghost has found its rest. The legend is complete.